In the gas-lit drawing rooms of Victorian Glasgow, Dr. Edward Pritchard was the picture of a perfect gentleman, handsome, well-spoken, and seemingly devoted to his sick family. He sat by their bedsides, giving them medicine with a steady hand and a comforting smile. But that medicine wasn't meant to heal. It was meant to kill. To the world, he was a savior. To his wife and mother-in-law, he was an executioner hiding in plain sight. It begs the terrifying question, when the devil wears a stethoscope and a silk tie, how do you see him coming before it's too late? Edward William Pritchard was born in Southsea, Hampshire, in 1825. It was a place where the smell of the sea and the sight of the Royal Navy fleet defined life. To understand the man who would become one of Scotland's most famous killers, you have to understand the world that made him. He wasn't born unknown. He was born into the strict world of the naval officer class. His father was a captain. From his very first breath, Edward was raised in a culture that valued rank, appearance, and keeping your feelings hidden above all else. In the Victorian era, your family background was your money, and Pritchard had plenty of it. He learned early on that if you looked the part and spoke with the right accent, doors would open for you. He pursued a career in medicine, joining King's College in London. By 1846, he had graduated, adding the respected title of surgeon to his name. But for Pritchard, being a doctor wasn't just about healing the sick. It was about status. It was about the authority that came with a stethoscope. He joined the Royal Navy, following in his father's footsteps, and served as an assistant surgeon on the HMS Victory. This wasn't just any ship. This was Lord Nelson's flagship, a floating symbol of British power. To have HMS Victory on your resume in the 1840s was like having a knighthood in the eyes of the public. It gave him an aura of heroism and trust that he hadn't really earned, but was more than happy to use. However, when we look back at this period of his life through the lens of history, we see the first signs of the mask he was carefully painting. Pritchard was a man who understood the power of a story. He told tales of his travels, of his medical skills, and of his naval adventures that were often exaggerated, if not totally made up. He was creating a character, the dashing naval surgeon, the man of science, the gentleman. In a society that was obsessed with respectability, Pritchard was the perfect product. He was handsome, with a striking beard and a strong presence. He could quote poetry, he could charm the wives of important men, and he could discuss science with the men. But there's a clear difference between a good doctor and a good actor. A good doctor listens, a good actor performs. Pritchard was always performing. He moved through the naval ranks and the social circles of Portsmouth with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was creating a version of himself that was safe from criticism. After all, who would question a man who had served on the Victory? Who would doubt the honesty of a King's College graduate? He was banking on the fact that in the strict class structure of 19th century Britain, a gentleman's word was his bond. If you looked respectable, you were respectable. This period, from 1825 to 1850, was the training ground for his later crimes. It was where he learned that he could control people's views. He learned that charm was often more effective than medicine, and that a confident lie was rarely challenged by polite society. He was building a suit of armor made of social standing, one that he believed would protect him from any checks. As he left the Navy and looked toward private practice, he wasn't just a doctor looking for patients. He was a predator looking for a hunting ground. He was armed with a perfect background and a morality that was totally empty. He was about to take this carefully built character and let it loose on the civilian world, where the stakes were different, but the potential for manipulation was even greater. If the naval uniform had been the costume of his youth, then the quiet market town of Hunmanby in Yorkshire was the stage for his first real performance as a civilian doctor. In 1850, Pritchard married Mary Jane Taylor, the daughter of a successful Edinburgh silk merchant. On paper, it was a brilliant match. Mary Jane was devoted, gentle, and came with family connections. Pritchard, the dashing ex-naval surgeon, swept her off her feet and took her to Yorkshire, where he set up his practice. To the locals, the arrival of such a distinguished couple must have seemed like a gift for the town. But it didn't take long for the shine to wear off and the rot underneath to show through. Hunmanby was a small place. In the 1850s, in a town like that, privacy was a myth. Everyone knew everyone's business, and Dr. Pritchard made it very easy for them to talk. The first cracks in his gentlemanly mask appeared in his finances. Pritchard had a taste for the finer things in life: expensive clothes, fine furniture, the signs of a success he hadn't actually achieved. He spent money faster than he earned it, building up debts that were huge for a country doctor. But in true narcissist fashion, he acted as though the rules of money didn't apply to him. He borrowed, he delayed, and he charmed those he owed money to, using his status to hide the reality of his coming bankruptcy. But the financial mess was nothing compared to his personal behavior. A doctor in the Victorian era held a position of total trust. He was allowed into the most private spaces of a home. He knew the intimate secrets of women. Pritchard abused this trust with a boldness that is shocking even today. Rumors began to spread around Hunmanby that the good doctor's bedside manner was far too friendly. He was a known flirt, a man who couldn't keep his eyes, or his hands, to himself. He targeted his female patients, using his power and his dashing looks to seduce them. It wasn't just a wandering eye. It was predatory behavior disguised as medical care. The town began to whisper. They called him the Pretty Liar. It was a nickname that cut deep. It acknowledged his charm. He was pretty. He was smooth. He was convincing. But it also marked him for what he was: a fraud. He would make promises he couldn't keep, tell stories that were clearly false, and flatter women while his wife sat at home. The prettiest liar label suggests that people knew he was dishonest, but were almost fascinated by the boldness of his lies. This was the place where Pritchard's dark side truly began to show. He learned that he could live a double life. He could be the respectable husband and doctor by day, and the immoral cheater by night. He learned that he could look his wife in the eye and lie without blinking. Mary Jane, alone in a new town, likely suffered in silence, following the Victorian code of standing by her husband no matter the shame. Her silence only made him bolder. The scandal in Yorkshire eventually became too loud to ignore. The debts, the affairs, the whispers, it was all closing in. But Pritchard didn't say sorry. He didn't change his ways. Instead, he did what all conmen do when the heat gets too high. He decided to move. He packed up his family, left his bad reputation behind in Hunmanby, and set his sights on a bigger city, a place where he could get lost in the crowd and start the cycle all over again. He chose Glasgow. He thought he was leaving his troubles in Yorkshire, but in reality, he was bringing his demons with him. and they were getting hungrier. The pretty liar was about to graduate from seduction and theft to something far darker. Leaving the whispers of Yorkshire behind him, Pritchard set his sights on the industrial heart of the empire. In 1859, he arrived in Glasgow, a city that was exploding with wealth, smoke, and ambition. To a narcissist like Pritchard, Glasgow wasn't just a new home. It was a vast, unsuspecting audience waiting for a leading man. He didn't just want to be a doctor here. He wanted to be a giant. The Victorian era was the golden age of the social climber, but Pritchard turned it into an extreme sport. He understood that in a city moving this fast, appearance was the only reality that mattered. He immediately set about joining the upper levels of society. He targeted the Freemasons, a group that held the keys to the city's business and social networks. By 1863, he wasn't just a member. He was pushing his way to the front of the room, shaking hands, buying drinks, and ensuring his face was seen in the candlelight of every meeting. But his desire for recognition went beyond standard networking. It became strangely obsessive. He joined the Glasgow Photographic Society, supposedly as a man of science interested in the new medium. However, his interest was less about the technology and more about the subject, himself. In a move that confused people, Pritchard began printing postcards featuring his own portrait. He would hand these out to strangers, to patients, to shopkeepers, anyone who would take them. It was a display of vanity that was almost sick. Imagine a man walking through 1860s Glasgow, treating his own face like money. He was creating a brand before the concept even existed. His need to be the center of attention led him to make up stories that were huge and easily proven false, yet delivered with such conviction that people hesitated to call him out. The boldest of these was his claim of a deep, personal friendship with Giuseppe Garibaldi, the legendary Italian revolutionary. Garibaldi was perhaps the most famous man in the world at that time, a symbol of freedom and bravery. Pritchard didn't just claim to know him, he claimed to be his close friend. He would tell elaborate tales of their meetings, weaving himself into global history. He even sent a walking stick to Garibaldi as a gift from an old friend, a stunt designed solely to be reported in the local papers. To the smart observer, these were the actions of a man with a fragile ego and a loose grip on the truth. But to the social elite of Glasgow, desperate for excitement, Pritchard was a colorful, charming character. He was the eccentric genius. They invited him to their dinners, they laughed at his stories, and they let him into their inner circles. They didn't realize that they were feeding a monster. Pritchard was testing the waters. He was learning that the bigger the lie, the more likely people were to believe it completely. He was building a fortress of reputation, a shield of gentlemanly status that he believed would protect him from anything, even the eyes of the law. And he would need that shield sooner than anyone expected. By 1863, the Pritchard family had moved into number 11 Berkeley Terrace. It was a prestigious address, a tall, impressive townhouse that signaled to the world that Dr. Pritchard had arrived. But while the front parlor was a stage for his social performances, the upper floors were becoming a setting for a much darker drama. The first act of violence didn't target his wife or his mother-in-law. It targeted the most invisible member of the household, the help. On a quiet evening in May, the peace of Berkeley Terrace was shattered by the smell of smoke. It was a scent that terrifies any homeowner. But in the gas-lit wooden houses of the Victorian era, it was a death sentence. The fire started in the attic room, the sleeping quarters of a young servant girl named Elizabeth McGrain. When the fire brigade arrived, they found a scene that defied natural survival instincts. The fire had taken hold of the bed, burning the mattress and the sheets. Lying in the center of the fire was Elizabeth. She was 25 years old, healthy, and by all accounts, full of life. Yet she lay there, perfectly still. There were no signs of a struggle, no scratches on the door, no body pressed against the window trying to breathe. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't run. She had simply burned. The official explanation offered by Dr. Pritchard was that the foolish girl must have fallen asleep while reading by candlelight, setting her own bed on fire. It was a tragic accident, he claimed, shaking his head with practiced sadness. But the details didn't add up. The firemen and the few neighbors who saw the body noted something strange. Elizabeth lay in a sleeping position, as if she were resting peacefully while the flames ate her alive. Whispers began to spread almost immediately, rumors that traveled through the servant networks of Glasgow. Why hadn't she woken up? The smell of smoke wakes the deepest sleeper. Unless, of course, she couldn't wake up. There was talk of a sweet, sickly smell in the room that wasn't just smoke, the distinct chemical smell of chloroform. As a surgeon, Pritchard had easy access to anesthetics. Had Elizabeth been drugged before the fire started? And then came the motive. In the weeks leading up to the fire, Elizabeth had been seen looking pale and sick in the mornings. The whispers turned darker. She was pregnant, and in a household where the master was known for his wandering hands and his pretty lies, the finger of suspicion pointed directly at Pritchard. A pregnant servant was a scandal that could destroy the reputation of the friend of Garibaldi. A dead servant, however, was just a tragedy. The coldness of Pritchard's next move was breathtaking. He didn't just cover up a potential murder. He tried to profit from it. He filed an insurance claim for the property damage caused by the fire. He put a price tag on the event that killed a young woman. He was making money from death. So why wasn't he arrested? Why didn't the police drag him away in handcuffs? The answer lies in the strict class structure of the time. The police were working-class men. Pritchard was a gentleman, a doctor, a Freemason. In Victorian Britain, gentlemen did not murder their servants and burn down their own houses. To accuse him would be to accuse the social order itself. The police took his statement, accepted his medical opinion that she had suffocated in her sleep, and tipped their hats. Pritchard had committed his first major crime, and the system had let him walk away. He had tested the limits of his immunity. He realized that the badge of doctor was a license to kill. The death of Elizabeth McGrain was the practice run. He had learned that fire destroys evidence, that dead women tell no tales, and that society would always give a gentleman the benefit of the doubt. The smoke cleared from Berkeley Terrace, but the danger didn't leave. It just moved downstairs to the master bedroom. The move to number 131 Sauchy Hall Street in 1864 was meant to be the peak of Dr. Edward Pritchard's carefully built life. Sauchy Hall Street was the heart of Glasgow's elite, a wide boulevard lined with the impressive stone houses of bankers and successful professionals. To the outside observer, the Pritchard household was a model of Victorian respectability. Here was a dashing doctor, a devoted husband, and a father, living in a home that showed stability and wealth. But if you could look through the heavy curtains and stone walls, you would find a reality that was rotting from the inside. The corruption began in the shadows of the household hierarchy. In the Victorian era, The line between master and servant was strict, but Pritchard crossed it with ease. The object of his attention was not a social equal, but a 15-year-old nursemaid named Mary MacLeod. By modern standards, Mary was a child. By the standards of the 1860s, she was a worker, but still incredibly young, naive, and vulnerable. She was invisible to society, but to him, she was an opportunity. The relationship was a terrible abuse of power. Pritchard didn't just employ Mary, he hunted her. He used his authority as the master and his charm to manipulate her into a sexual relationship. When Mary became pregnant in the summer of 1864, the mask threatened to crack. A child with a servant would destroy Pritchard's social standing faster than any debt. He handled the problem with the coldness of a surgeon performing an abortion on the girl himself. It was a brutal act that bound Mary to him through shared shame and trauma. But Pritchard needed to keep her quiet. He needed to ensure her loyalty as he moved toward his darker goals. And so, he made a promise. It was a promise so chilling that it reveals the planned nature of everything that followed. He held this 15-year-old girl, who was likely terrified, and he told her, "When Mrs. Pritchard is gone, I will marry you." He did not say if, he said when. With the motive set, a desire to remove his aging wife to make room for a younger replacement, Pritchard turned his attention to the method. In 1864, the laws for buying poisons were frighteningly loose, especially for a doctor. There were no digital records. A doctor's signature was a license to kill. Pritchard went shopping. He walked into a local chemist's shop, likely greeting the staff with his usual charm. He asked for supplies for his medical practice. He didn't buy a weapon that would leave a mark. He bought chemistry. First, he purchased a large amount of tartar emetic. This is a white, odorless powder made from antimony. In small doses, it was used to cause vomiting. In large, repeated doses, it is a torturous killer. It copies the symptoms of natural stomach illness, uncontrollable vomiting, cramps, dehydration, and a slow, wasting fatigue. It effectively turns the body against itself. But Pritchard wasn't satisfied with just suffering. He needed certainty. He also purchased Fleming's tincture of aconite. Aconite is known as the queen of poisons. It is a powerful toxin that affects the nerves. It creates a burning sensation in the mouth, slows the heart rate, and eventually causes the heart to stop. It leaves very few traces. To buy such a substance required a reason, but Pritchard was a doctor. He claimed he needed it for external application on patients with nerve pain. He walked out of that shop with death in his pocket. He returned to 131 Sauchiehall Street, greeted his wife Mary Jane with a smile, and hung his coat in the hall. The boldness of it is breathtaking. He was sleeping with the teenage maid in the attic, promising her a wedding ring while carrying the chemical weapons that would make her the mistress of the house. He was not a man acting in a fit of passion. He was a man who had decided that the lives of the women around him were simply obstacles to be removed. The betrayal was absolute. By November of 1864, the atmosphere inside the Pritchard home had shifted from tense to terrified. Mary Jane Pritchard, the woman who had stood by Edward through his money troubles, began to fade. It started simply enough. A headache here, a wave of nausea there. But very quickly, these symptoms turned into a violent, constant illness that confused everyone who saw it. Everyone, that is, except her husband. The poisoning of Mary Jane Pritchard was not a quick event. It was a siege. Pritchard didn't give her one massive dose. He gave her just enough to keep her sick, to keep her weak, and to keep her dependent. Every day became a cycle of pain. She would wake up feeling slightly better, only to be struck down after breakfast. The vomiting was constant. She couldn't keep food down. She lost weight rapidly, her skin turning a pale gray. She complained of a burning fire in her stomach and a strange, metallic taste in her mouth, classic signs of antimony poisoning. But the most terrifying weapon in Pritchard's arsenal wasn't the chemical. It was the psychological torture. He began a campaign of manipulation that was as cruel as the poison itself. In the Victorian medical world, women's pain was often dismissed as hysteria, a label for anything a male doctor couldn't explain. Pritchard used this prejudice against his own wife. When Mary Jane cried out in pain, Pritchard would soothe her with a voice of false concern, but then he would turn to the servants or visitors and whisper, "She is very excitable," or "It is her nerves." He began to suggest that Mary Jane was a secret drinker. He told colleagues that she was drinking spirits during the day and that her vomiting was the result of alcoholism. He systematically destroyed her credibility. Mary Jane, alone in her sick room, began to doubt her own sanity. She trusted Edward. He was a doctor. If he said she was hysterical, surely he must be right. Then, in a twist that should have saved her, Mary Jane left Glasgow. In late November, she traveled to Edinburgh to visit her family. The effect was instant and miraculous. Within 48 hours of leaving Sauchiehall Street, the vomiting stopped. The color returned to her cheeks. She ate full meals without pain. For weeks, she lived a normal, healthy life. This period in Edinburgh is the smoking gun of the case. It proved that the poison was not a disease within her, but an external force within her home. Her body was healing the moment she was away from her husband. Her family in Edinburgh begged her to stay. They saw the change. They perhaps sensed the darkness waiting for her in Glasgow. But Mary Jane was a product of her time. She was a dutiful Victorian wife. She believed her place was by her husband's side. Despite her recovery, and perhaps despite a hidden fear, she returned to Sauchiehall Street just before Christmas. The moment she crossed the doorstep, the nightmare resumed. It was immediate. Pritchard was waiting. He welcomed her back with open arms and a dose of poison. The very first meal she ate at home brought the sickness back with a vengeance. But this time, Pritchard was more aggressive. He brought in a colleague, Dr. James Gairdner, to look at the case. This was a calculated move to show he was doing everything possible. But before Gairdner even entered the room, Pritchard stopped him. He told Gairdner, "My wife is a drunkard. She is suffering from gastric fever brought on by drink." He poisoned the doctor's mind before the doctor could examine the patient. When Gairdner saw Mary Jane, he saw what he had been told to see, a hysterical, sickly woman. He prescribed champagne and rest, unaware that he was playing into the killer's hands. Mary Jane tried to tell them. She said, "I am not drunk. I am ill." But her voice was weak, and the voice of the confident Dr. Pritchard was strong. She was trapped in her bed, burning alive from the inside out, nursed by the man who was mixing the poison into her food, while the world outside believed she was simply a woman drinking herself to death. It was a slow, agonizing erasure of a human being. As the winter of 1865 tightened its grip on Glasgow, the situation inside number 131 Sauchiehall Street had become a standoff of suffering. Mary Jane Pritchard was fading, her body destroyed by the constant illness, that only seemed to strike when her husband was near. But just when it seemed she was entirely alone, help arrived. On the 10th of February, Mrs. Jane Taylor, Mary Jane's 70-year-old mother, stepped off the train from Edinburgh. Mrs. Taylor was not a week-old woman. She was a matriarch. She was sharp, devoted, and deeply suspicious of the vague diagnoses her daughter was receiving. She didn't come to Sauchiehall Street to sit by the fire. She came to take charge. She immediately moved herself into the sick room, sleeping in the same bed as her daughter to watch over her. She took control of the cooking, preparing meals with her own hands on the gas stove in the bedroom, avoiding the kitchen where Pritchard and his poisons ruled. For Dr. Pritchard, the arrival of his mother-in-law was a disaster. She was an obstacle. She was a witness. And most dangerously, she was interrupting the slow, methodical process of his wife's murder. If Mary Jane recovered under her mother's care, questions would be asked. Pritchard realized that the strategy of slow poisoning was no longer working. He needed to escalate. The obstacle had to be removed, and quickly. The weapon he chose was terrifyingly ordinary, a batch of tapioca pudding. On the 13th of February, Mrs. Taylor prepared the pudding for her daughter. It was intended to be a safe, plain meal for a sick person. However, she made a fatal error. She left it to cool in the dining room before serving. Pritchard, ever the opportunist, seized the moment. He slipped into the room. We don't know exactly what he added, likely a heavy dose of antimony, or perhaps the aconite he had been saving. But within seconds, the healthy dish was turned into a lethal weapon. Later that evening, Mary Jane ate a few spoonfuls and immediately complained of a bitter taste and sickness. Mrs. Taylor, perhaps frustrated by her daughter's lack of appetite, or simply not wanting to waste food, decided to finish the pudding herself. It was a decision that sealed her fate. The reaction was catastrophic. Within an hour, the 70-year-old woman was violently ill. The poison tore through her elderly system with a violence that was shocking. She was vomiting, collapsing, her body rejecting the toxic load. But Pritchard didn't panic. He saw an opportunity. As Mrs. Taylor lay groaning in pain, he offered her his medical assistance. This is where the science of the murder shifts. Up until now, Pritchard had been using antimony to cause suffering and weakness. But for Mrs. Taylor, he switched to the queen of poisons, aconite. While antimony creates chaos and noise, aconite brings silence. It acts on the nervous system, slowing the heart rate, numbing the body, and eventually causing the heart to stop. For the next 2 weeks, Mrs. Taylor lingered in a twilight of pain. Pritchard played the role of the devoted son-in-law perfectly. He hovered over her, adjusting her pillows and giving her medicine that was actually slowly stopping her heart. On the 25th of February, the end began. Mrs. Taylor was sitting in the drawing room, attempting to write a letter. Suddenly, her head dropped. She slipped into a coma. Pritchard, faking panic, sent for Dr. James Patterson, a local doctor who had previously seen Mary Jane. When Dr. Patterson arrived, he walked into a scene that should have set off every alarm bell in his head. He found 2 women in the same room, one dying in the bed, the other weeping beside her. Pritchard, with tears in his eyes, told Patterson that his mother-in-law had suffered a stroke. Dr. Patterson looked at the patient. He saw the small pupils. He felt the weak pulse. He noted the lack of typical stroke symptoms. To a trained eye, this didn't look like a stroke. It looked like drug poisoning. But here
we encounter the true tragedy of the Victorian medical profession. There was an unwritten rule, a code of professional etiquette that forbade one doctor from accusing another of bad practice, let alone murder. To accuse a gentleman like Dr. Pritchard without absolute proof would be professional suicide. So, Dr. Patterson did nothing. He wrote a prescription, shook his head, and walked out of the house. He left Jane Taylor to the mercy of the man who was killing her. 3 days later, on the 28th of February, Jane Taylor died. She had come to Glasgow to save her daughter, and she had been murdered for her trouble. Pritchard, with the boldness that defined his entire criminal career, certified the death himself. He wrote paralysis and stroke on the death certificate. He had killed his mother-in-law under his own roof, signed her death warrant with his own pen, and buried her with a lie. The witness was gone, and now the path to Mary Jane was clear once again. With Mrs. Taylor cold in her grave, the clock began to tick for Mary Jane Pritchard. She was now truly alone. The psychological barrier of her mother's presence was gone, and the physical barrier of her mother's cooking was removed. She was isolated in the master bedroom of number 131, grieving, terrified, and physically destroyed. Pritchard wasted no time. The slow poisoning accelerated into a sprint. The days following her mother's death were a blur of pain for Mary Jane. The doses of antimony increased. The vomiting became constant. She was wasting away before the eyes of the servants, a living ghost haunting her own bed. She was delirious, talking of strange men in the room, likely hallucinations brought on by the poison and starvation. Through it all, Pritchard sat by her bedside. He held her hand. He fed her ice. He whispered word of comfort while he mixed the very poison that was killing her into her wine.
On the night of March 17th, the end finally came. Mary Jane, sensing the darkness closing in, asked for her husband. Pritchard came to the bed. In her final moments, she reportedly looked at him with eyes full of trust and fear and whispered, "Edward, don't leave me." It is a sentence that echoes through history with heartbreaking irony. Even as he murdered her, she clung to him as her only comfort. She died in his arms in the early hours of March 18th, 1865. Now began the second act of Pritchard's dark play, the grieving widower. If killing them was the work, mourning them was the art. Pritchard didn't just act sad, he staged a tragedy. He wept openly in front of the servants, sobbing about his sainted Mary Jane. He wrote letters to his friends filled with flowery language about his heartbreak. But the true measure of his evil was revealed during the funeral preparations. It is a scene that earned him the nickname that would stick for history: the human crocodile. As Mary Jane lay in her coffin in the parlor, Pritchard led a group of mourners, friends, colleagues, fellow Freemasons, into the room to pay their final respects. He demanded that the lid of the coffin be unscrewed so he could see her one last time. Then, in a display that made the observers uncomfortable, he threw himself upon the corpse. He kissed her cold lips. He touched her face. He cried out to God, asking why he had been abandoned. "Come back to me, my darling," he wailed. It was a performance designed to gain sympathy, to cement his image as the devastated husband. But to those watching closely, it felt wrong. It was too loud, too rehearsed. It was the tears of a crocodile, a predator weeping over its prey before eating it. He insisted that Mary Jane be buried in the same grave as her mother, Jane Taylor, in the Grange Cemetery in Edinburgh. He wanted them together, he said. A touching thought, or perhaps a practical way to hide the evidence in a single plot. He went with the body to Edinburgh for the burial. At the graveside, his performance continued. He was supported by his brother-in-law, Dr. Michael Taylor, the son of the woman he killed, the brother of the wife he killed. Pritchard shook the man's hand, hugged him, and wept on his shoulder. He accepted the condolences of the very family he had just destroyed. It was a betrayal of Shakespearean proportions. However, Pritchard had made a critical error. His arrogance had blinded him to the one thing he couldn't control: the silent observer. While Pritchard was busy performing his grief, a letter was making its way through the postal system of Glasgow. It was addressed to the Procurator Fiscal, the Scottish public prosecutor. It was anonymous. The author simply stated that the sudden deaths of two women in the same house, under the care of the same doctor within 3 weeks of each other, was suspicious and demanded investigation. The police didn't arrest him immediately. They waited. They let him finish his performance at the funeral. They let him return to Glasgow by train, believing he had committed the perfect crime. He stepped onto the platform at Queen Street Station, feeling the weight of freedom on his shoulders. He was ready to claim the insurance money. He was ready to marry Mary MacLeod. But as he walked through the station, a hand touched his shoulder. It wasn't a friend offering sympathy. It was the heavy hand of the law. The coffins he had wept over were not going to stay in the ground. The earth was about to give up its dead, and the science of poisons was about to wipe the crocodile tears from Dr. Pritchard's face forever. The game was up. The hand on the shoulder at Queen Street Station was not just an arrest. It was the beginning of a forensic examination that would strip Dr. Edward Pritchard of his gentlemanly mask once and for all. The spark for this downfall was a single sheet of paper, an anonymous letter sent to the Scottish public prosecutor. To this day, the identity of the author remains a subject of debate. Was it a clerk who noticed the odd things in the death certificates? Was it a neighbor who saw too much? Or was it Dr. Patterson himself finally finding a way to speak out without breaking the code of medical etiquette? Regardless of the source, the letter did what the doctors of Glasgow failed to do. It demanded the truth. The investigation that followed was swift and brutal in its efficiency. The machinery of Scottish law, once started, moved with terrifying precision. The first order of business was to check the contents of the coffins Pritchard had wept over so dramatically. The body of Mrs. Taylor was dug up from the Grange Cemetery in Edinburgh. The earth had barely settled on Mary Jane's grave before she, too, was brought back into the light. This was the moment science took the stand. The bodies were handed over to Dr. Frederick Penny, a famous professor of chemistry. In 1865, toxicology was entering a golden age, and Pritchard had severely underestimated its power. He likely believed that by mixing the poisons, antimony and aconite, he could confuse the symptoms and mask the chemical trail. He was wrong. Dr. Penny's analysis was devastating. He found antimony everywhere. It was in Mary Jane's liver, her intestines, her stomach. It was in Mrs. Taylor's blood. The levels were so high that it suggested a long, relentless giving of the toxin. The gastric fever and stroke were scientifically proven to be lies. The bodies told the story of a slow, agonizing murder. The trial of Dr. Edward William Pritchard began in July 1865 at the High Court in Edinburgh. It was the sensation of the decade. The public gallery was packed with the very society people Pritchard had tried so hard to impress. They came to see the human crocodile fight for his life. And fight he did. but in a way that revealed the true depths of his cowardice. Pritchard stood in the dock, perfectly dressed, maintaining his air of injured innocence. But as the evidence mounted, the purchase logs from the chemists, the testimony of the servants, the damning chemical reports, his defense team grew desperate. The most shocking moment of the trial came when the defense attempted to shift the blame. Realizing the poison was undeniable, Pritchard's lawyers tried to pin the murders on Mary MacLeod, the 15-year-old nursemaid he had groomed and abused. They painted her as a jealous, vengeful girl who had poisoned the mistress and her mother to clear the path for herself. It was a disgusting strategy. Here was a grown man, a doctor, a father, trying to send a teenage girl to the gallows to save his own neck. He claimed she was the mastermind, and he was just an unaware victim of her plans. But the jury looked at the trembling girl in the witness box, and then they looked at the arrogant man in the dock. The power dynamic was too obvious. Mary MacLeod admitted to the affair, admitted to the abortion, and admitted to buying some of the poisons under Pritchard's orders. She was a pawn, not a player. The testimony of Dr. Patterson was the final nail. He admitted to the court that he had suspected poisoning when he saw Mrs. Taylor dying. The judge and the public were horrified. "Why did you not speak?" they asked. Patterson's defense was the strict code of professional etiquette. He could not accuse a fellow doctor. It was a chilling reminder of how the silence of good men had allowed Pritchard to continue his work. The trial lasted 5 days. The jury took only 1 hour to reach their verdict. When the foreman stood up, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Guilty of both charges. Pritchard did not scream. He did not weep. He simply bowed his head, perhaps realizing that for the first time in his life, his charm had failed. The Lord Justice Clerk put on the black cap and sentenced him to death. The Prince of Poisoners had been dethroned, and his final destination was set. Not a grand estate, but the scaffold at Glasgow Green. In the days following the verdict, the mask of Dr. Pritchard finally crumbled, revealing the erratic, desperate mind beneath. Confined to the condemned cell, he engaged in one last attempt to control the story. He issued a series of confessions, each one different, each one trying to save some scrap of his reputation. First, he admitted to killing Mrs. Taylor, but claimed Mary Jane's death was an accident, an overdose of medicine he had miscalculated. He blamed it on a moment of madness fueled by whiskey. It was the classic narcissist's plea. I did it, but it wasn't really my fault. He refused to admit that he had tortured his wife for months. But as the date of execution drew near and the hope of a reprieve vanished, he finally confessed to everything. He admitted to poisoning both women. He admitted to the affair. He admitted to being a monster, though he likely never understood why. The 28th of July, 1865, dawned gray and misty over Glasgow. It was a significant date in British history, though few knew it at the time. It would mark the last public execution in Scotland. The scene at Glasgow Green was huge. Estimates suggest that over 100,000 people gathered to watch the doctor die. They came from all over the country. Trains were running special services just to bring spectators to the city. The crowd was a sea of faces, a mixture of anger, curiosity, and morbid fascination. They climbed onto rooftops, hung from lampposts, and crushed against the barriers of the jail, chanting songs about the human crocodile. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the prison bell began to ring. The doors opened, and Dr. Edward William Pritchard stepped out onto the scaffold. He was dressed in a fine black suit, his beard trimmed, his shoes polished. Even at the end, he was obsessed with appearance. He looked out at the ocean of people who had come to see him hang. There was no cheering, just a terrifying low hum of thousands of voices. He listened to the prayers of the chaplain. He didn't ask for forgiveness from the crowd. He knew there was none to be found. Calcraft, the famous hangman who had traveled from London for the job, stepped forward. He placed the white hood over Pritchard's head, extinguishing the view of the city he had tried so hard to conquer. He adjusted the noose, placing the knot under the left ear. Pritchard's last words were reportedly a quiet prayer, claiming he died in the hope of a blessed resurrection. It was a final delusion of grandeur from a man who believed he was special until the very end. The bolt was drawn. The trapdoor opened. Dr. Edward William Pritchard dropped into the darkness. His death was instant, a sharp contrast to the slow, agonizing ends he had inflicted on his wife and mother-in-law. His body hung there for the required hour, swaying gently in the morning breeze, a grim warning to the citizens of Glasgow. When they cut him down, he was not returned to his family. There was no grand funeral, no weeping mourners. He was buried in an unmarked grave within the prison walls, his body covered in quicklime to speed up decomposition. The friend of Garibaldi, the hero of the HMS Victory, became just a pile of bones in a prison yard. The execution of Dr. Pritchard closed a chapter on a specific kind of Victorian horror. It shattered the illusion that a gentleman was incapable of savagery. It forced society to look into the drawing rooms of the elite and realize that monsters didn't just lurk in the dark alleys of the East End. Sometimes they sat at the head of the dinner table, smiling, serving the wine, and waiting for the poison to take effect. Pritchard's legacy is not one of medical brilliance, but of the ultimate betrayal of trust. He reminds us that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who wear the best suits, tell the best stories, and hold your hand while they watch you die. If you found this case as disturbing and fascinating as I did, please hit the like button and subscribe. There are many more stories hidden in the archives, waiting to be told. Until next time.